Arash and I met through the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Lausanne, called EPFL. I was doing my MBA there, and Arash did or teaches there in various classes. And we started talking. I think we reached out to each other even before I started at the school, and then our paths crossed again. And we started talking more around education and design and how those areas overlap, what the opportunities are around service design, what the gaps are. And sort of that discussion led us down a path. So we've been talking for months about we should do some kind of program, and it's starting to bear fruit. So we've been planning the details for the past couple of months. And we already had one webinar about a month ago where we discussed about systems thinking for service designers. And now we are sort of continuing this because we wanted to, we saw great interest, and I'm happy to see that this time around the interest in terms of registrants for this webinar was even higher. So very good, and welcome all who are joining since I'm talking. And I wanted to mention a bit as a quick intro around where the name comes from, Design Dissolve. And it's very funny because we were talking about we should find some overarching name for this effort that we're trying to put together, which is not just the webinars but more around trainings as well. And I proposed, how about design dissolve, something around that. And Arash loved it. And he had the same idea, but from a completely different source, because I was looking at it based on our discussions on how the designer gets dissolved in the problem and sort of should become a part of it. And he was looking at it from the dissolving a problem perspective, where dissolving the problem is really the only way to really resolve it for the long term by changing the system that produces that problem, coming from Dr. Russell Eckhoff. So this is a webinar. We will be talking about a university accredited training that is linked to this effort as well after the descriptions or the presentation from Arash. And I will introduce Arash Golnam. So he really takes an interdisciplinary approach to service design and services, combining industrial engineering, systems thinking, systems dynamics, analytical psychology backgrounds. And he has published also in service systems papers through EPFL. And without further ado, Arash, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks a lot, and welcome everybody. Today I want to share some insights from systems thinking for you who have an interest in service design or you already are service designers. We had a first webinar, so this webinar is somehow building on that. I don't know how many people have attended the first one. I have a quick slide to introduce myself. I did industrial engineering, industrial management back in Iran. This is 12 years ago, and then I came to EPFL on a Ph.D. scholarship. I did something in between management and engineering there at the time. Afterwards, I started working as a system dynamicist, which system dynamics is a discipline in which we try to build mathematical simulations of complex adaptive systems. So after my PhD and a year of postdoc at EPFL, I started working in system simulation. Then I realized that my academic background was not sufficient to tackle industrial grade projects. So I did a second master's degree. So I really explored the frontiers of science there. Some disappointments here and there. I decided to take a reverse path. And for the past 3 years, I've been a psychoanalyst in training at C.G. Jung Institute in Küsnacht near Zurich. I've lectured in universities in Geneva and Lausanne area for the past 10 years. And very recently, I am working as an independent educator. At the same time, I'm completing my work on a book I've been working on, which combines insights from systems thinking and analytical psychology for service design. This is a quick intro. Systems, the semantic space. There's so much talk about system and so little understanding. So let's see what the semantic space for the word system and the concept of system is. Some pairs of opposites for you: analysis versus synthesis. We've heard this a lot. In analysis, we break things down into their constituent elements, and then we try to develop an understanding of the parts, hoping that this understanding of the parts can somehow integrate into an understanding of the whole. Synthesis, on the other hand, is taking a step back and see the system in focus, or the phenomenon in focus, how it relates to other phenomena, and what type of interactions or interconnectivity exists between these phenomena and the phenomena that surrounds or neighbors it. We have an analytical approach in, let's say, our understanding of our environment. We can look at, for instance, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We break things down as much as we can, hoping that this, let's say, fragmented knowledge that we generate can somehow integrate into an understanding of the whole. And then these 17 goals are further down, again, broken down into 179 around that, sub goals and so on and so forth. So this analytical approach exists a lot in the way we tackle problems. Here is a quote which I really like from Alfred Whitehead. He says, "The result of teaching small parts of a large number of subjects is the passive reception of disconnected ideas, not illuminated with any spark of vitality. Let the main ideas which are introduced be few and important, and let them be known into every combination possible." So this is a different approach. This is a synthetic thinking approach. You introduce one idea and then you see how it connects to the second before you introduce the third. Because as you introduce more and more elements, the complexity of the system increases exponentially. So you'd better introduce them one at a time and then explore all possible relationships between them. And we have basically an alternative approach. This is a very scary model I'm showing you that J. Forrester developed in 1971, in which he had a very, let's say, few or limited number of key concepts for modeling dynamics of what we are trying to model now with the SDGs. So he actually identified, let's say, 5 key ideas that you can see here as stocks, and then he'd really explore all possible combinations amongst them. So this may look very scary in the first glance, but when you break it down and you understand it part of the time, it makes a lot of sense. We can see this approach also in what they're doing right now in Climate Interactive, which is in Climate Interactive, they put together all these different aspects and let's say dimensions that are important in understanding the climate change. And you can manipulate any part of the system, and every part is connected to the rest of the variables and the rest of the dimensions. So I would highly recommend you to go over to the climateinteractive.org and play around with the model to see how changes in one dimension of the system can precipitate a chain reaction in others and change the total state of the system. Some ideas for you that are, because I've heard people saying that what's the alternative to the SDG? We already have models since 1970s that have been doing this, but somehow analytical and reductive thinking has been gaining more popularity. The next pair of opposites is energy versus synergy. The example I give always is the Dark Side of the Moon album, which is one of the most famous rock albums ever. There you can see there's a drum track, which is very normal. There is a vocal track, very normal guitar and stuff. But when they come together, they take on a collective characteristic that makes that album one of the best or one of the most popular rock albums ever. The elements on their own are not that significant, but the combination, or let's say the synergistic effect that emerges out of the combination of the elements becomes something very significant. There's this Italian painter that is famous for painting portraits using pieces of fruit. They ask him, what do you think, where do you get your inspirations for your portraits? He says, well, I don't paint portraits, I paint fruits and vegetables. It's the people who see the portraits. So there's some emergence here at work. You know, in a system, there's always things coming together, and they point to something which is bigger than the elements, basically. And the next pair of opposites is sign versus symbol. Sign is designed in a way that is understandable to no matter where, no matter whom, no matter where. On the other hand, a symbol is something that points to something which is more, or which is bigger than itself. It's more like saying something to the effect that I can't tell you what it is, but I can tell you something about it. So the symbol tells something about something, which probably is not very easily discernible. There's something mysterious. So it tries to establish a connection with some sort of a mystery. Now, why am I talking about these pairs? If you put them together, you see that there's a right-hand side that they start with sy. And whenever we have a word with a prefix of sy, it means putting things together. The same thing is for system. The word system is like that as well. So when we're talking or thinking in terms of systems, it's always putting items, elements together, and then generating something which is bigger than those items or elements. So many people have this misconception that anything can be labeled as a system, but that is not true. There is 4 characteristics that we need to tick in order for a system to exist, or let's say a systemic lens to exist. So first of all, we should know that the system is a whole that cannot be divided into independent parts without loss of its essential properties or functions. So a system is not divisible. So traditional methods of analysis will fall short because once you divide it, you lose touch with something essential about the system. At the same time, if you work on the performance of the subsystems or parts of the system separately, if they are improved, the performance of the system may not, and in most cases, not improve. So subsystem optimization results in system sub-optimization. You can see it in the context of an organization where if you optimize for one department, that can break the coherence between the organizational, let's say, coherence amongst all the departments that can result in a systemic effect. And thirdly, a subsystem cannot alter the system on its own. The only way a subsystem can alter the system or the state of the system is through a pattern of interaction with some other subsystems around it. So one thing cannot change what's happening as a whole. One thing can lead to a change into another thing. And through this chain reaction between subsystems, let's say a collective change in the state of the system can happen. And finally, when there's a change to the state of the system as a whole, this change can result in changes to the subsystems. So there's the principle of feedback. You cannot just look at it in a linear fashion, that you change one subsystem, that subsystem changes another subsystem, and then collectively they change the system as a whole. This comes back, this change to the state of the system somehow feeds back into the states of the subsystems as well. So these are the very, I would say, 4 criteria that we could have in mind whenever we are thinking about a system. This way, a company cannot be defined in terms of its departments. A person cannot be defined in terms of what he does, what he owns, and where he works for. So there is something more than that that we can think if you want to look at a person as a system, basically. So this is the semantic space of systems. A case here for you is in education. So education is a service, a very important one. Now, if you look at the system of education, we see that education systems mainly are topic-based. So we have topics coming together, again, with the hope that a coherent whole will emerge out of them. But most cases, it will not happen. We need to have a skill-based education system in which we target a number of skills. These skills have been very frequently published by World Economic Forums, and when you look at them, you see most of them are somehow soft skills, skills that are not codifiable. They're not, let's say, codified bodies of knowledge, like, for instance, some parts of engineering science, or let's say things that can very well be defined. So they are mainly soft stuff. So there is an emergent property in and one thing about creating these soft skills is that you cannot address them directly. They are almost always a byproduct of a learning process or a journey people go through, and then these skills will emerge. So we can see, in order to achieve, let's say, a system of education or an education service which is systemically coherent, we need to somehow have a top-bottom approach, understand the skills that need to be built throughout that program, and then the journeys through which those skills can be built as byproducts, and how these journeys can somehow fit together to create that, let's say, the modules that the students go throughout the program. We really lack this systemic design understanding of education, I would say. Next idea I want to talk to you about is, again, I'm referring back to some of the ideas that I spoke about in the previous webinar. I'm trying to build upon them with some more substance and some more examples. So some parts of this may be repetitive for some of you, but I think to build, let's say, a starting point for everyone, we need to go over some of these basics a little bit as well. So we spoke about these 4 layers for causal tracing. We start with events. One thing happened, which is observable, which is somehow explicit. We can sense it. And then we put that into a context. There's a contextual or temporal dimension that this event belongs to. And then we come another level down, understanding what is the structure that is in place that is generating that event or pattern of behavior in which that event exists. And those structures are almost always results of mental models. So there is a thought, there is a pattern of thought, a set of ideas or assumptions that generate those structures. And then those structures will result in generation of those patterns, out of which one of those events will be observable and discernible. We gave an example of Amazon.com. For those of you who remember, one of the examples we went through was Amazon, that basically in Amazon, they created the marketplace, which was a structure, and that marketplace resulted in creation of value for customers because everyone could sell their books alongside Amazon books. So the event was that customers were enriched. They could get a book at a lower price because there were multiple biddings for it, including the bidding of Amazon. And at the same time, they could find books that were out of print and Amazon couldn't sell. So this really improved the service for the users, but it came out of a thought pattern, out of a mental model that basically we shouldn't be competitor focused. We should be customer focused. If we bring our customers in and they can create some value for our customers, if we bring our competitors in and the presence of our competition on our platform can generate value for our customers, then we got to do that basically. So these are some of the ideas that we went through. And one other example that we are all familiar with is a keyboard, that if you look, the design of the QWERTY keyboard has not changed for over a century. And when you look anything that is physical, or let's say a physical manifestation of an idea for design, it can fit this pattern of causal tracing that I told you about. At the time, most of you may know this, in order to eliminate the jamming of the keys and the mechanical levers, they decided to distribute the letters that are used frequently together. So that's why we have a keyboard with the layout that we are currently using. And many people may think that this is the most efficient keyboard, but it actually is not efficient at all. The reason why we're facing this is that is a design choice that was made to eliminate a problem that is no longer relevant because we're not using any, let's say, physical mechanisms for typing anymore. Now, in education, again, we can talk about this as a service. Again, I try to bring examples from education, which is a service I'm very familiar with. Now, we have 2 different types of mental models that can result in different structures. One mental model is I am the sage on the stage. Most of us have probably gone through this. There is someone in front of the classroom. This person lectures for most of the class time and then answers questions if there are any at some point. And what are the basically patterns? The patterns of behavior that emerge out of this structure is that, well, people get bored. There is too much teacher talk time. There is not as much student talk time at all. There is no pattern of interaction. There is no spontaneity. There is no room for improvisation, for, let's say, bringing the contents that are somehow in response to what is happening in the class, addressing the mood of the classroom or the mood of the day or the issues around the topic. So this is one, let's say, chain that we can follow. And up there, we can have people who are bored. When a student touches his phone 90 times during a course, that's an event that belongs to this pattern of interaction down there. So instead, if you have this collaborative learning structure in which the teacher comes to the class, this is the topic, let's let's learn about this topic together. If someone has an idea about this, these are the material. The teacher is not the gateway between the material and the students in the let's say conventional frameworks. There's always a teacher who possesses the material, the slides, the material that are coming with the textbooks and stuff. And the only way for the students to have access to this material is through the teacher. So he acts like a gateway. But in the, let's say, collaborative learning structures, we have flipped classrooms in which all the material is shared in advance with the students, and the teacher's credibility doesn't come from the fact that he owns the material. So the material is accessible for everyone. And then the next point is, all right, now let's gather our heads around this and see what interpretations, what uses, what applications we can deduce from the material. So there's two different ways of, we can see two different structures that are generated out of different ways of looking at education. The sage on the stage, or we're all in it together, let's learn together type of mentality or mental model can generate different ways of structuring the classroom, and different basically patterns of interaction between the teacher and the student, and some events that are observable at the end of the day. That is the second part that I wanted to share with you. I have a few more ideas to share, and afterwards I'm going to stop and we're going to answer your questions. One more part that I'm really excited about, or fascinated by, is basically designing and learning. For me, they are intertwined. So we sometimes say, okay, I need to learn to design, but for me, designing to learn is the other side of the coin. So learning and designing are intertwined. We have to somehow design situations in which from which we can learn, we can gather information and data, but not only that. And that takes me to the topic of single loop versus double loop learning. This is an important topic that I think we all need to somehow have running at the back of our heads when it comes to learning, because our learning can be limited in terms of just getting some information in and basically learning at the level of data or information or maybe some knowledge. But I would say true learning is a learning in which we update, we refine, and we fine-tune our mental models, basically. So there is two layers of learning that can happen in any situation. One is limited at the level of data and information, but the other one goes at a more profound level. So double loop learning is a very important, I would say, tool for service designers or for anyone who engages in any design activity. And I talked about the Amazon example already. And here we could see Amazon bringing in competition on their platform. We can think about it in terms of what happened in Amazon at the level of data and information only, saying that, yeah, Amazon's price Amazon's stock price was so low at that point, it went up at this point, all data. We can say that in 2000, they brought in the competition, again, at the level of data or information. We can think about it really in those terms, but a more profound way of looking at it is that, what can I learn from this example that I can extrapolate to no matter what situation later on? That is not context specific. So true learning, in my opinion, is context neutral. You can apply it to no matter what context, and somehow it will generate insights for you in those situations as well. So if we go back to the iceberg view, I would say we have the corresponding part here as well, that events are at the data level, patterns or trends are processed data put into a context or a temporal form. We have information. Then we have knowledge, which is the interpretation of that information to some extent. But wisdom is basically the qualitative change in the way we generate knowledge, in the way we actually gather information and data. So double loop learning is about mechanisms through which we can somehow target generation of wisdom for ourselves. And this is something that, in my opinion, is also lacking in the education system, because it's more synonymous with taking in information rather learning how to learn, or thinking about the way we think, refining our mental models and honing our learning abilities. So how do we learn to learn better? What are the skills that we need to have? Because probably in the future, that is the thing that can distinguish us with algorithms and, let's say, all the AI that is happening, learning how to learn. This is a level of abstraction that may not be reachable for machines. So these are the things we need to think about. So learning and designing, they're intertwined, but learning is beyond taking in data and information. It's beyond memorization. Learning should be also looked at through the point of view of generating wisdom and bringing about qualitative changes to the way we perceive, to the way we look, to the way we take in data, and to the way we process that and we interpret that. That is another important point, in my opinion, that we can learn from systems thinking. Once we do this causal tracing, we come to the level of, let's say, mental models. The next question is, where is this mental model coming from? What is it a product of? How can I fine-tune, change it in a way? Because changing, let's say, mental models is a time-taking process. They're very subtle and in most cases not easily noticeable. The next idea is the difference between map reading and map making. We are, most of the times we are handed maps. We need to navigate territories when it comes to design. These territories are uncertain, these territories are dynamic, but the maps that we have, that most of you are familiar with, sometimes are inaccurate. They're not sufficient. They do not reflect the dynamics. They do not correspond to the dynamics of the situations that we face. So two ideas here is that we most of the times have very linear ways of looking at things. If you look into the textbooks, you see all these linear models marching from left to right, top, bottom. We look at, for instance, PhD theses, you see there we have independent, dependent variables. This is also a linear way of looking at things. If you look, for instance, at government policies and COVID infection rate, which one is dependent, which one is independent? They are somehow intertwined. The policies determine the infection rate. The infection rate as in its on its own will also determine the policy. So we need to break free from this linear mode of thinking. And the models do not incorporate a temporal dimension. So we cannot see how something evolves over time. And we all know that in any given system or for any given service, there are variables that are really crucial and essential for us to keep track of. But the models we're using do not provide us with that possibility. There is a third limitation that I want to talk about today, which is the models we're using are basically some maps. So we are just using a map that has been generated by someone somewhere, try to fit it into a situation. And we don't learn how to make maps. One of the key skills that we should have, in my opinion, is conceptualizing, let's say, problem situations. It means we should have tools with help of which we can derive essential properties of these systems. And then based on those, we can generate our own map. So we're not handed basically tools that can, or let's say frameworks or ideas or theoretical insights that can help us in conceptualizing problems. We are basically fed with ready-made, basically existing off-the-shelf type of ideas that we hope can fit the situations that we are facing. This reminds me of a story that is at the beginning of a book called Exploring Requirements. It's a very nice book. I would say is a must read for all the designers. It doesn't have the word design in its title, but it talks about design all way along. So the authors, Donald Gause and Gerald Weinberg, talk about this story of a man in New York City who was selling a product which was known as a guaranteed cockroach killer. And when people bought that product, they were given 2 blocks and a set of instructions which read like, place cockroach on block A and then hit cockroach with block B. So that's the guaranteed way of killing the cockroach. So if I want to use this as an analogy, I would say placing the cockroach on block A is conceptualizing the problem. Once you learn how to conceptualize the problem is somehow reduces in complexity, and then solving it becomes, or dissolving it or resolving it becomes a lot easier. In some cases, conceptualization of a problem is synonymous with basically the solution that emerges. So the next step is really minimal compared to the conceptualization step. So in most of the cases that that we are working with the models, there is a ready-made model. Okay, all right, fit this to your situation, and then out of this, something is going to emerge that can help you basically get where you want to get. But we know that really the heavy lifting is looking at a problem and extracting those essential dynamics of the problem and somehow building an understanding of them, somehow translating them into a form that in which we can play and we can somehow manipulate so that it can shed light on different, let's say, constituencies or different dimensions of the model in a way that we were not able to do otherwise. So conceptualization or problem structuring is a very key skill that by using ready-made tools, we are losing touch with. And there's this quote from Bertrand Russell from a book he wrote. It's one of his final books that is not technical at all. It's called The Conquest of Happiness. It's a very light book compared to anything else he's written. And he says, in your work, there is two elements that can make you happy, basically. You can make your work interesting. First is the exercise of skill. So that notion of skill we talked about as well. Skill, not just topics or buzzwords, something that you're skillful in, and then you exercise that. And second is construction. And by construction, he means is something that you can build on. You know, you look at something, then you build on it, and then you learn more about it, and you take it further. So it's something like, let's say, a process of working with reality and building ideas around it, and somehow fine-tuning them step at a time. And other thing I've noticed is that the tools that are out there, they deny us this possibility, because sometimes it takes us a short amount of time to master them, but their usability is very limited. We cannot play around with them for months and hoping for new insights to come out, and hoping for basically insight to come out that can help us on the level of wisdom generation, so that we can get better in conceptualizing problem situations, not only using the tool itself, but also next time we see a problem, say, oh, probably I know how to approach this. Probably I know more about that extraction or let's say abstraction process of the problem, that I can somehow in a meaningful way put together a number of elements or variables that can convey that essential property of the problematic situation that I'm facing. So this construction thing, when I was reading that, really resonated with me. The fact that we can have tools that are modular and we can build on them. And the good news is that in systems thinking, we had that possibility. The tools we use in systems thinking are basically very close to this nature. If you take the analogy of a language, this is a causal loop diagram that we use in systems modeling, in which two variables are linked. So one variable linked to another variable will become a word. Then if you form a loop out of it, then you have a sentence. Then if you put different loops together, you can construct paragraphs, basically. And then you can start building around this and somehow mapping the dynamics of the system, translating them into words, sentences, paragraphs, playing around with the words, with the sentences, to see how the paragraphs will change. And then somehow understand the system in a way that is basically very, I would say, compatible with the nature of the situation that you're facing. And these models, they take a bit of time. There's a learning curve there for using them. But once you use them with the notions of the two types of feedback loops that we have, which is the reinforcing feedback loop and the balancing feedback loop, we can play around with them. We can buckle them. We can create, let's say, systems archetypes. We've heard probably about limits to growth. We have probably heard about shifting the burden. We have probably heard about tragedy of the commons, growth and underinvestment. So they are all different ways of buckling and putting together and combining these modular pieces and somehow generating insight at the systems level that can tell us something about the behavior overall, of the overall system. So that's something I really like about this. And once you have this, you can translate them into quantitative models. which can generate, let's say, scenarios for you that you can simulate. See if this changes in the system, what would happen in the system if this changes, for instance. You can test your assumptions. You can provide a platform in which assumptions can be tested and somehow refined. These are the possibilities that we have once we ground our work in a theoretical foundation, once we had a theory out of which we can generate techniques and methodologies. In most cases, the templates we're using are atheoretical. So there's nothing, let's say, underlying them that can give us these possibilities that we have with tools and frameworks that are grounded in theory. So I would say shallow inquiry versus rigorous inquiry. There's nothing more practical as a good theory. So theory, many people have a negative connotation about it, but once the theory is boiled down in terms of a tool, a technique, let's say, or methodology that embodies that theory, and you learn how to use it in a, let's say, in a very useful way for conceptualizing a problem, then theory becomes super useful. So nothing is more practical than a good theory, in my opinion. Finally, some last ideas for you about what we're trying to put together with Peter, and Peter is going to talk about it more in a while. But I think there is a need for new imperatives, for a new paradigm shift in the education system, especially when it comes to designing services, especially when it comes to design, because designing is more than basically a scientific approach. It's science combined with arts, combined with craft. So there has to be something which is different. And I have three, let's say, ideas that can tell you how this new paradigm should be different. I would say, first one is that thinking should not be taken as a synonym for analysis. Thinking is not synonymous with analysis. We have different ways of thinking. We have analytical thinking, the one that is promoted in our educational programs, but we have holistic thinking, we have feedback thinking, lateral thinking, synthetic thinking. Not all thinking is analysis. That's the first thing we need to remember when it comes to design thinking, I would say. So we definitely need different ways of defining thinking and different tools for approaching thinking. That's the first one. Second one is that thinking is one of the four functions of consciousness. So even if we know all different dimensions of thinking, then we have intuition, sensation, and feeling, because together they will form our, let's say, conscious attitude, the attitude with which we take in information and data and we assess situations. And it gives us, let's say, a readiness for action. Our readiness for action comes out of our conscious disposition, our ego consciousness, the functions of our ego consciousness, sensation, intuition, feeling, and thinking. And I would say intuition and feeling are really downplayed a lot in our education system. And if you look in designing, especially with anything that is somehow disruptive in nature, there is a very, very, let's say, big ingredient of intuition and feeling that comes in. Because when you're talking about disruptive or radical innovation, there is no historical data. You're giving born to something that does not yet exist. So you cannot go back by methods of analysis and time series or evidence-based methods analyze situations. You need new machinery for doing that, and intuition and feeling are parts of that machinery that can equip you with those capacities. And finally, not everything is conscious. A lot of our decisions and a lot of our reactions to what happens in our everyday life come from unconscious processes. And creativity, creativity itself, you cannot approach it in a conscious way, by just combining things. Okay, there's an idea there. I combine this idea with that idea. As David Lynch puts it, creativity is basically like catching fish. You have to go under the water in an environment that you're not familiar with, and then come back with something. It's more like hunting in an unknown space where the rules are different, and you go in there and then you come back with an idea. So based on these principles, we have designed, let's say, a program for service design. And this program ticks a number of characteristics that I mentioned as well throughout the call. the webinar, which is based on interactive and active learning paradigm. People bring material, is flipped. We go through ideas before the sessions. People come, we share, we exchange. It's truly interdisciplinary. So we're not going to reduce things into templates, into, let's say, tools that are reductive. We're going to look into psychology, understand the functions, and then see how that understanding can help us in the generation of ideas, in basically our the way a service or a product is perceived by people. We offer tools for conceptualizations. We're not going to give maps. We're going to help people in developing their own maps. It's targeted at refining learning and basically thinking, and is systemically modular. As I told you, the modules that we have put together, they start with thinking, they will look at the 4 functions of the consciousness, and then they see what is the bigger context out of which these functions emerge. So that takes me to the end of my talk. It took a bit longer than what I was basically supposed to take, but hopefully it did not bore you much. And now, Peter, it's back to you, and I'll be very happy after your presentation to take questions and to have an exchange with you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Arash. And there are some questions that were coming in the meantime, which I tried to answer, and there are also a few that I will highlight in a minute. And if in the meantime you now have some questions, then feel free to shoot them in here. So basically, this was the second webinar. We already had one about a month ago. You were able to find that on dissolve.design. This is the second webinar, and we are thinking of doing some further webinars around the topic next year, not this year. Though the dates for that are not planned. If you signed up now and then you're here, then we will reach out to you on your email address. You know when there are future webinars available. But more important, or basically the next level from the webinars is a training course that we're putting together with Arash that he mentioned as well. So the first part of it is this what we're calling systems thinking for service designers. And the first cohort will start mid-January, so January 13th. And it's a, sorry, I'll just some people. It is available from the 13th until the 17th of February. We're running. It will be 6 classes of 100 minutes on a weekly cadence every Wednesday at 6 p.m. CET. And more important than this is that it will be kept at 10 people. So it's a really small cohort, because what we want to do is really build on discussion and interaction, and not just have an online learning type of training that you can do and that you are used to in massive online learnings, for example. What's really important and really fresh off the press is that this is a university-accredited certificate of attendance that will be issued by Franklin University, Switzerland. We'll mention a few words about Franklin in a minute. So this is not just a training, but it's actually something that we're doing together with Franklin University. So adding some power behind it. And the original fee is 870 euros for this, but the first cohort gets automatically a 50% scholarship. So the price of the first cohort will be 435. But don't discourage if you don't think that, or if you think that you will not be able to or that you will be able to make the first cohort, because this is not just a one-off thing that we are planning. What we want to do is really, as Arash mentioned, have this sort of systems thinking for service designers really be the entry point and basically one building block of a larger certificate of advanced studies that we're also doing with Franklin, where the idea is that the first part will be systems thinking, which already in itself is a complete item. So it will end with a cliffhanger, but it already gives you value in its own. However, there are further trainings which will be very similar in both size and structure that will build on this. So one part of this will be sort of this, one side of it will be the systems side, and the other will be the psychology side. So already, as Arash mentioned, when looking at designing services, one part where you need to look at is upstream into the system, and the other direction you need to be looking at and conscious of is downstream into the minds of both the participants in the system and yourself as the designer of that system. And so really this advanced study certificate will be looking at both of those sides, and then we will be sort of closing that off with a capstone project. And further details will be shared about this certificate later on. And then a few mentions of, or a few thoughts about Franklin University. It is based in the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland called Ticino, and it has an accreditation both in Switzerland and the US. It has a very international campus and is already focused on small class sizes and a strong student-faculty ratio. So it's the combination of these reasons why I will not try to take credit for this. It was Arash who was able to arrange our cooperation with them. So right now, for this first cohort of the 6-session training course, you are able to sign up right now at dissolve.design. We already have a few signups from the previous webinar, and I know some of you are here, so hello. And without further ado, I will open up for questions. I see that some things have been coming in